Okay, and so let's establish this appropriate attitude as we embark now on the teachings. This attitude of a great yearning to attain the enlightened state of Buddhahood in order to best benefit all sentient beings. So we are in the 8th chapter of this Shantideva's Way of the Bodhisattva, and we've covered up through verse 96, and so we'll start with verse 97. Shantideva already has broached the main topic of this chapter, or of the meditative concentration, by going into the methods of equalizing self with other. First, by recognizing how, just like oneself, all sentient beings have that same feeling of happiness and wanting to avoid or get rid of pain and suffering. Of course, that can also become philosophical in a way, or we just have that sort of belief or aspiration, but then to actually meditate on bodhicitta, which is the intention of this chapter, then we need to go a little further, as Shantideva does here, by refuting, or by it's become a common motto in some with teachers and Buddhist circles, that we say very easily how all beings want happiness. And all beings want to avoid suffering. Here, Shantideva is recognizing that even though we say that, we still cling to our own territory, our own body, our own agenda, our own self. And we don't exactly have that same feeling towards others. We're always kind of protecting ourselves, protecting our happiness. And so what Shantideva is saying here is that we should actually get used to being others, in the same way that we have gotten used to being who we think of as ourselves. But that is, I don't say merely a habit. That is something that we have since we were babies and prior become habituated to, that this is my body. Consciousness claims this body and secures this body as its own and protects it and seeks to satisfy it. And how there's nothing special about oneself wanting happiness when it's really the common experience of all beings. And so what it's a rather exotic or challenging what he is saying here, where we need to become habituated. We need to develop a new habit of regarding who we think of when we think of ourselves, that I and me is actually all beings. So we don't have to, he's not saying that we need to do anything particularly to get rid of our clinging. Like this is a practice for people who cling, who have a self, who cling to a self. And so, okay, now take that habit of clinging to self and cling to other beings, all other beings, as being self. That's very interesting and something that's doable every throughout the day, every so often. Just bring that to mind, that I am all beings. And like I protect myself, now all beings should be protected from misfortune and suffering. All beings should be happy, like I want to be happy. It's just a shift in our perspective, our point of view. And as he goes through several logical justifications for the validity of that way of thinking, how like I and other and here and there have no ultimate meaning. It's all just point of view. There's no absolute here and there's no absolute there. And in the same way, there's no absolute me and there's no absolute other. And so logic is, and as he continues to do throughout here, he presents a logical basis for expanding and gaining confidence in the validity of that method of becoming familiar with, method to become familiar with. So So then in verse 97, he is answering an objection. And of course, when he presents, as he's done in previous chapters here, when he's presenting like, oh, someone may object and say, like he does here, since the pain of others does no harm to me, I do not shield myself from it. So I do protect myself from suffering, but I don't have to protect myself from other people's suffering because it doesn't affect me. And so that objection to thinking in this way of that I am actually others isn't just some other person or other philosophical or other spiritual school or philosophy, but really we can't help but assume that these are all strategies that our own ego will shield itself from. And so here when he says, since the pain of others does no harm to me, I do not shield myself from it. So why guard against my future pain, which does no harm to this, my present me? So Shantideva is undermining how we can't say that we can't or shouldn't protect others from suffering, because we ourselves protect, he says here, we protect our future self from suffering. Like we'll buy groceries today because our future self at the end of the week is going to be hungry. But what he's saying, he's undermining that as a, if we, basically what he's saying is that our future self is a different entity than our present self. Our future self is just as much an other as others are an other now. So my future suffering isn't tormenting me now. Only my future me. We think that there's a future me who will be hungry or will be suffering. And so we do seek to prevent suffering from occurring to who we think me will be in the future, when in fact, that is another entity. Of course, this is a very Buddhist view. And it goes on to the next verse, to think that I will have to bear it. In other words, that the same me will have to bear my future suffering is in fact a false idea. For that which dies is one thing, what is born is something else. So because we cling to our aggregates, our we cling to appearances, we cling to feelings and sensations, and even our consciousness and the projections of our consciousness. We cling to those things, both in, and then of course he's also, the scope is what that which dies is one thing, what is born is something else. Who basically in Buddhist thinking, like when one who dies is distinct from one who is born next. Our lifespan as a human, basically our consciousness is experiencing itself as a human according to, and the duration of that lifespan is based on karma, both the intensity and the quality, all the different infinite factors that make up the whole process of causation, cause and effect, and intention. And when that lifespan, when the karma no longer supports that consciousness experiencing itself as a human with a human body, and that karma is exhausted, then that consciousness ends, as that human consciousness ends, and as the consciousness then becomes a consciousness of a future birth, a future being with a body of a future lifetime. With its karma. And they're distinct in that way. Our mind and our body, our mind, meaning our consciousness with its human karma, ends when that karma exhausts, and its body ends at death. And mind, consciousness, then arises, occurs with a body at birth and the next birth, whatever it might be. It's not the same person, just like as it talks about in the commentary here. It's just like lighting, like one candle, lighting another candle. That flame of that one candle doesn't transfer to the other candle. Nor is it, but the first candle depends on its litness, and it's being lit. It depends on the previous candle, but the candle is not the same as the new candle that's lit. So this is sort of in Buddhism, it can't. This is how we say that not to fall into the two extreme views of eternalism or nihilism. That things are not different, but they're not the same. They're distinct, but not the same. And so even though consciousness arises, for instance, if through a lot of terrible karma, negative karma, and when your karma as a human being does no longer support your consciousness experiencing itself as a human being, and the body that it is that it identifies as being the body of that consciousness, when those both collapse because of the lack of karmic support, then a new consciousness interdependent with the time of death, then that new consciousness arises with the body that are and together. So karma, there's still karma there. And of course, karma and understanding the infallibility of karma and the infinity of karmic causes and conditions is really something that it's one area that we can grow confident in and have more trust in karma as we pay attention to it and see causes and effects in our own life and contemplate all the various ways that we can approach karma to get kind of all the different windows that we can examine karma with, but really to really understand karma that's sort of the domain of an enlightened being. So 97, 98. So to think that I will have to bear it is in fact a false idea. We're always thinking that my future, like I'm creating virtue now so that in the future I will have, I'm being generous now, and generosity leads to prosperity. But that who experiences that will not be you in the future. That's what the point is here. To cling to aggregates are all the chunks and pieces of our emotional and mental and physical experience. To cling to that is a mistake. And so so again, this thinking in this way breaks down certain barriers that may arise in why we feel we can't or shouldn't equalize or make ourselves actually others. And always, and there's a lot of logic here and reasoning that Shantideva is using, and always the injunction of logic is that if something doesn't stand up to logic, it should be rejected. So then in verse 99, again, there's another strategy that will prevent us from fully involving ourselves with this, where we say okay. So it's not for the sufferers. It's for the sufferers themselves, you'll say, to shield themselves from injury that's come. The pain felt in my foot is not my hand, so why in fact should one protect the other? So the first two lines have to do with how we may think that, well, if others are suffering, then they are the ones that have to free themselves from suffering. They need to, pull themselves up by their own bootstraps or what have you. That it doesn't make sense for me to do that. not others. It's not up to others to free others from suffering, is what they're saying. But and Shantideva in the last two lines then refutes that by saying that makes no sense, because the pain felt in my foot, if we get a thorn in our foot, our hand runs to the rescue of that toe and pulls out the thorn from the foot, when the pain is only in the foot, not in the hand. So it makes no sense to say, or we could say it makes the same sense to say, well, if I get a thorn in my foot should get rid of that thorn, and my hand is perfectly happy. There's no basis for my hand to be involved in it. And it's the same logic that if others are suffering, then they should get rid of their suffering. It's not my responsibility. So it's that's the logic there. So that makes no sense, basically, that logic. If you're made up of parts, as it talked about in the verse, the earlier verses of this, on the previous page, we are just a composite. We are just an aggregation of parts, and even those parts that aggregate, that we call our body, even those parts are made up of parts, which are made up of parts, which are made up of parts. And so there is no actual entity that's separate from any other entity. Okay? So then, verse 100, then Shantideva said, true, it's inadmissible, you'll say. It happens simply through the force of ego clinging. So by inadmissible, it means that it's not logical. Of course, it's not logical to protect that it's because of we've become habituated. That's why hand takes care of foot, because it's just a habit. And but then Shantideva in the second part says, but what is inadmissible for others and myself should be utterly discarded. So that is to say, suffering, which is the object of what is to be discarded, should be discarded as much as possible, even in the face of ego clinging. Even in the face of our habitual ego clinging, we should still do as much as possible to relieve suffering, because it's still a delusion. It's still based on a mistake, a delusion. So we can't just sort of dismiss our equalization process and having this global scope in all of I. You know, if we think of I being all sentient beings, then I am affected. I am suffering with as all sentient beings. And even though I still have this self-clinging, that's what's kind of beautiful here. It's not like we are supposed to conduct ourselves in such a way, and we're not exactly, how do you say? We still have ego clinging. And this is a practice for people that have ego clinging. And we don't sidestep it. We don't pretend or or meditate on not having ego clinging, which is maybe there's a method like that too. But here is like, I have this ego, and now I am making that ego be all sentient beings. And when I think of me, I think of all sentient beings. So if any or all sentient beings are suffering, then that is me. I am suffering. If they're happy, then I am delighted and happy. And as it says earlier in the previous verses, getting used to that attitude, getting used to that habit, that mindset, I guess you could say. I think what he's saying is then automatically there will come a compassion and love that will care for others. That is the source of our love and compassion. Is that ability and that expansive view of I am all sentient beings and we are all alike in regards to particularly happiness and suffering and all of their gradations. So then there's also this next 101. Now it gets a little bit more tricky here. An objection would be here then that there, even though there's not. Here, I'll read this first here. Continua and gathering, so-called, like garlands and like armies, are unreal. So there is no one to experience pain, for who is there to be its owner? Suffering has no possessor, therefore no distinctions can be made in it. Since pain is pain, it is to be dispelled. What use is there in drawing boundaries? So this has to do with maybe we are thinking that, well, there is, even though when our present life or our present moment ends, that there's, and then the next one begins, there's still some continuum. There's still something that is uninterrupted that persists there. And so there may not be a single entity that migrates, but there is some continuum. This is kind of a philosophical language introduction here. And also there is this, that things have that there is a composite, that things are composed of parts, so that justifies how the hand comes to the aid of the foot. So one does protect the other because there is this entity or this continuum that still connects these two, hand and foot, for instance. Like garlands and armies. So like a garland or like a mala. This continuum, it seems like it's continuous. You're saying mantras or whatever, and it's like just a continual, it's like a mala. We say give me that mala, or I'm holding my mala as if it was one thing, when actually it's just individual parts with a string holding it together to give the illusion that it is a singularity. It's one mala, say. And or the other example is of an example of a continuum, that there's this continuum. And then the other example here of an army, meaning a gathering, that there's like the army that's fighting the other army. And in fact, there is no actual army, it's just a label, like a mala is a label for a thread of what seems to be a continuous set of beads. And there's an army, and they even try to fool themselves into thinking that they are a single entity because they all wear the same uniform. And the other people the enemy wears another uniform. And so that's our army against that army. And they have flags and all these trappings to reinforce the delusion that there is such a thing actually as an army. And that's important. That's how the army works. That's how an army functions. And there's a hierarchy. And these are all just artificial imputation, overlays to reassert the power of the identity as this being an army, an entity. In fact, it's just individual people clustered together with their own individual aggregations, their own individual kleshas, their own desire, their own attachments and hatreds and prejudices and pride and their own jealousies and envy and their own fears and their own doubts. And even that's all, like, who's the owner even of those fears, and who's the owner of that aggression or that pride? There is no owner. So the whole thing is an illusion. And similarly, then he's saying there is no, even when it comes to samsara, which is, what do we say? Now that I and others are lost in this ocean of samsaric suffering. Like an ocean of samsaric suffering means that everywhere you go, or there's no part of an ocean that's not wet. There's nowhere you go in samsara that isn't a form of suffering. It's all pervasive suffering. And then the suffering of change from happiness to pain, or from happiness to suffering, and then the suffering on top of suffering, the suffering of actual real pain. And then there's the all-pervasive suffering. All-pervasive suffering is sort of the target of Buddhism, Buddhist practice. Many, even animals, don't need to be taught to avoid the suffering of change. When it's cold, then they huddle, or they go into the middle of a tree or into a cave or something, or they bunch up together, or if they are in pain, they try to get rid of that pain. So there's many different, and humans, they invent different methods to avoid or counteract the suffering of pain. We have sophisticated medical system, and a lot of intelligence in our medical industry, and then also the suffering of change, happiness to suffering. We have religions and philosophies and psychologies and therapy and all these things. But this all-pervasive suffering, or what could be called imminent suffering, there's always this feeling of imminent suffering that underlies all of our experience. There's always this underlying uneasiness to our experience, and then that's all-pervasive suffering is particularly the target of Dharma practice. So when we say suffering, it's a very loaded term, and it doesn't just mean bad things happening. So anyway, so there's no. That was a little. What was it called? I digress. So here, there is no one to experience pain. That's everything. These things that seem to be part of a continuum, or clusters and gatherings of entities, are an illusion. It's only the coming together of many instances. It's just a name, and we give names, and they're imputed. That is to say, it's just an overlay. That thing itself there's no basis for that. So this is a theme that we keep repeating again and again. But then the last two verses here, there is no one, the last two lines there. So, therefore, there is no one to experience pain, for who is there to be its owner? If there's no being, if there's no body to experience, if there's no body, since we can dismiss the idea of body being some monolithic entity that we own, but it's just a composite, it's just an aggregation of infinite parts, of which body is not even one of them. There is no actual basis for the label body. We use the term body as just a sort of a functional purpose, but it doesn't actually correspond to anything in reality. Just like I is a functional term. Like when you know the answer to a question, then you put up your hand and say, I know the answer. And it's just functional, but there is no actual corresponding entity that matches that label. So in this way then, pain, which is this ocean of suffering, is not owned by anyone. No one owns pain. Can't be owned. And then it says that suffering has no possessor. There's no subject. There's no experiencer of pain. And so no distinctions can be made between my pain and your pain, between our pain and their pain. There's no basis for that. And pain is to be dispelled altogether. Pain itself needs to be removed. Why? Because pain is pain. Pain must be removed. What use is there in drawing boundaries? Why make Why make limitations? So our habit is to undermine the limitations that we have been bound by. And it's delusional, and it's delusional, and we could even say here irrational or illogical to think only to be rid of your own pain. There's no basis. There's no reasonable reason to think that way. So why make limitations? What use is there in drawing boundaries? Oh, very, very interesting. Very, it's very exotic and challenging in a way. Then, moving on to 103. I don't mean exotic. I mean like Shantideva is very radical, I guess. It's very radical. It's radical. He's really making a high bar or pushing the envelope. All these slogans we have, Shantideva is, so what use is in drawing boundaries? Okay, then again, we're saying, okay, that's clear. There's no self. There's no owner to pain. So then we could say to ourselves, or it says, then an objection would be like, well, why dispel the pain of all? If there's no self, then there's no suffering. There's no one suffering. Suffering is not harming anyone. Why dispel the pain of all? And so then, of course, Shantideva dispenses with that refutation or objection by saying you cannot argue this way. In other words, it's not just. It's just that to say that is to cling to this from the absolute truth point of view. That's correct. But since we have pain and we seek to remove it, then we're talking about relative truth. And from the point of view of relative truth, if my pain should be removed, then so should that of others. It logically follows that if my pain should be removed, then the pain of others should be removed. And this idea that there's no one experiencing the pain it's admissible if we're talking about absolute truth. But if we're talking about the feeling of pain, then we're talking automatically, we're talking about relative truth. And we should also recognize that this chapter, the context for meditative concentration and the development of the object of meditative concentration here is bodhicitta. And the point the context of that, as in the previous chapters, is wisdom. We have to remind ourselves again that the real point of this is wisdom. And these are measures to take, just as patience is a measure to take, and diligence is a measure to take, and meditative concentration is a measure to take to get to wisdom. It's through wisdom that we actually are able to benefit others. So these are methods. So it's premature to pull out the absolute truth card and dismiss the means to that the very truth, to realizing that truth. That's the Bodhisattva path, not to just adopt a certain philosophical stance of emptiness or things like that. In fact, there is no such thing as emptiness anyway. So, yeah. Okay, then 104, 105, 106 also is kind of could be, ego's strategy to not want to make this way of this practice the habit. And we may feel compassion makes us feel such pain, you say, so why should we make efforts to engender it? That's a good question, because if suffering is to be removed, why would we want to suffer from developing compassion? Because we're actually stepping up the what are we doing? Stepping up the like we're focusing on the suffering of all beings, those that are living on the earth, those that are under the earth, those that are in the space above the earth. All samsaric beings are suffering, and we're taking them as those who we are, I guess, as a bodhisattva, that we are responsible for. We have made a vow to free them from suffering. And then when we think of the suffering of sentient beings and the cause of it and the challenge of that, and of the challenge of relieving that suffering, when you think not just of the effects, but the causes of suffering, that's a suffering. That's the suffering of, I guess, a bodhisattva. I don't know, but here it says, compassion makes us feel such pain. Why should we make efforts to engender it? We weren't suffering, and then we started practicing the path to bliss and enlightenment, and suddenly now we were creating so much suffering that we didn't have before. But then he, of course, Shantideva says, thinking of the sufferings of beings, how can you regard as great the smart of your compassion? So our suffering that we feel by engendering compassion, as Shantideva says, is not so bad. It's not so bad when we think of the suffering of beings and the effects of their actions, that is to say, the causes of suffering, the aggression and the grasping and the stupidity and bewilderment and jealousy and all the afflictive mental states that cause corresponding degrees of suffering. When we think of that, either in a global sense and then just like one being in a hell realm, like that's much greater than the pain of our compassion. And so he's saying that we should, compared with others, our suffering is not so bad. And if by compassion, or he says, I'll read it, and if through such a single pain, that is to say, of compassion, a multitude of sorrows can be cured, the sorrows of others can be cured, such pain as this, all loving people strive to foster in themselves and others. So he's saying we must strive to foster this kind of compassion in ourselves and in other practitioners, should foster it in others. The sorrow of compassion is to be, we need to train and cultivate the sorrow of compassion. I think of Tumba Rinpoche, so we have to find the heart of sadness to really be a genuine practitioner. He also said these kind of things. He's very powerful language user, Tumba Rinpoche. Also, we need to peel away the scab on our heart so that we bleed out. And so our compassion is nothing really. It's like if we have to take a splinter out, we have to dig it out. Or if we have a blood clot in our veins, we have to cut and open up and do very invasive, aggressive pain that we take. We couldn't even survive that kind of pain without narcotics. And even with it, the body is so traumatized by that invasion, but to save your life. So just balancing the two, there's no argument about that. Then in verse 106, thus Supushpa Chandra, knowing that the king would cause him harm, did nothing to escape from tribulation, that the pains of many should be ended. Supushpa Chandra, he was during the time of the Bodhisattvas. Okay, he was lived during the time of a previous Buddha, and he had the we call it wisdom. He had the kind of the spiritual accomplishment of foreknowledge, and he knew that there were thousands and thousands of people that would be liberated if they heard the Dharma taught by him. And also he knew that the king had an injunction against teaching the Dharma. And so he knew he would be killed, but he knew that so many people would be liberated. And so he, I think he went and he taught. He did he taught during the day and practiced at night and so on and so forth. And then when the king had somebody catch him and then execute him. And he knew that was all going to happen. But it was a small price to pay for so many individuals liberated from suffering, from samsaric suffering. So that kind of bodhisattva activity is what Shantideva is referencing here. That the pains of many should be ended. Okay, so then 107, now Shantideva is I guess, shifting into explaining or mentioning what the benefits of this kind of practice are. Here he says, those whose minds are practiced in this way, whose joy it is to soothe others' ills, will venture into a hell of unrelenting pain as swans sweep down upon a lotus lake. So those whose minds have grown accustomed to this view of the equality of self and other, when you become accustomed to that, and you then there's a natural joy that arises from that. That's one of the benefits of it. And that joy is enables you to enter into the lives of others, and with that aspiration to remove the suffering of others and regard that you'll work for the benefit of others with a sort of a joy and an enthusiasm, just like swans sweep down into a lake of lotuses. That's the way a bodhisattva enters into even the lowest hells of suffering with that kind of joy and enthusiasm. Then 108 says, the ocean-like immensity of joy arising when all beings will be freed. Will this not be enough? Will this not satisfy the wish for my own freedom? What is that to me? So here there's some reference here to the liberation of the Shravakayana, the path of those who engage in practice in order to free themselves from suffering, to attain nirvana and the end of pain. That there is the experience of contentment and joy in that Shravaka approach. And here Shantideva is saying that the happiness of that kind of liberation is not, basically saying that's not for me. But the type of liberation that lacks the flavor of, or the core, or the flavor of altruism is pointless. Like this, the liberation of and what might be called the Hinayana, or the path of the individual liberation, is kind of pointless. Because the joy, the happiness of that liberation is nothing compared to the happiness when all beings will be freed. And so he's sort of ironically saying, won't that be enough? Won't that be satisfying? My own freedom, basically, for the Bodhisattva, if you're engaged in liberating all sentient beings, who cares if you're liberated or not? The joy of that is greater than anything. And so the wish for my own freedom, comparatively, the wish for my own freedom is, what would we say, kind of insipid. So this having this global, or this vast scope of all sentient beings is, that's the greatest joy. Then 109, The work of bringing benefit to beings the work of bringing benefit to beings will not then make me proud and self-admiring. That is to say, working for the benefit of beings means that you are not acting in a self-centered way. And so there's no real, it can't make you conceited. It's free of that self-interest. And you really make this, again, this is this becoming habituated to this, to all sentient beings being what I think of as I. When we say, I am suffering, we're referring to all sentient beings, not to one person, me. Me means all others, equally, you and all others. Yeah. We shouldn't think that we're excluding ourselves, but we're training and becoming habituated to not making a distinction between ourselves and all sentient beings that way. Yeah. Let's see, the work of bringing benefit to beings will not then make me proud and self-admiring. He's making a statement. It won't do that. So we don't have to worry. If we're really practicing and getting used to this way of relating to our life, then we won't be proud and self-admiring or self-centered. The happiness of others is itself my satisfaction. I do not expect another recompense. So I don't, this working for the benefit of beings in this way, in other words, with this frame of reference, is its own, has its own rewards. There's nothing else is needed. And I don't expect another recompense in some future life even. So then, this number 110 is this kind of concluding verses, this kind of a summation that Shantideva usually makes at different points when he's coming to the end of a certain section here, where he says, therefore, just as I defend myself from even slight disparagement, in just the same way with regard to others, I should likewise have a mind protective and compassionate. So regardless of, like, when we're criticized or we are falsely accused, since now his habit has been to take others as himself, when he and others are equal, there'll be no distinctions between that. And so he should have that compassionate and protective attitude with regard to others. Protect others from being disparaged or abused or harmed or made to feel afraid. So then, up to 100, verse 110 is the end of this section that began with section 8, verse 90. So there's 20, 90, 100, 110. There's 20 very pithy verses there that really present something both challenging and indispensable for living the way of a bodhisattva. And as we'll take up next time, it becomes the basis to begin engaging in a genuine way in the exchanging self and others. And so we'll take up that practice next time, and next time after that. That's a little. There's many verses about that. So as I said previously, and just from time to time, of course, ideally here you would go through the first section the first section of this chapter of subduing distractions, both by creating a safe outer zone where you can be isolated and alone, and then dispelling the inner distractions of those of desire and competitiveness and so forth, and possessions and investment strategies and all these things that will distract you. So you kind of sweep away the gross sources of your distraction in this way, then set to task on sitting in a good posture, and then practicing equalizing self and other in this fashion. Of course, this is meditative concentration, and as we know, that always involves the shamatha, the development of shamatha, which tames the mind. Tames the mind, meaning what's tamed are the affliction, the mental afflictions, emotional and mental afflictions, and remaining in that state. Shine means to remain in that state of stillness, or that state of having pacified the kleshas, just enough. Just enough. There's different stages of shamatha we should know. And we read, and maybe if you've studied or maybe been on shamatha retreats where you go through these so that there's absolutely no movement whatsoever of thoughts. Here, particularly in the Mahayana, this shamatha is we just get to some stage of taming the mind so that mind can be observed when it's still and when it's in motion, when it moves. And then we direct its movement towards an object. And in this case, it is bodhicitta. And bodhicitta here means developing it through equalizing self and other as an object of meditation. And so the longer you can practice this and become habituated to it, then the deeper and more significant it will become. So you can do this short time, many times. Usually we think about meditation as short time, many times, rather than trying to force yourself for long time. And you can develop different flaws in meditating, like your mind can kind of go overboard. Overboard meaning start popping too much, too frantic mind, wild mind, or becomes dull. Meditating, everything is very still, but long periods it becomes duller and duller. So this we don't want either, particularly Mahayana. And if you have aspirations in the Vajrayana, the emphasis is on the clarity of mind, not on the stillness of mind. And so here, this development of conceptual practice of like equalizing self and other becomes a way of taming our mind, developing not only shamatha but also this insightful insight, which again, because this is the foundation for wisdom, not the foundation. This is how we approach wisdom. Okay, so then we'll end tonight. Good luck.